Welcome to Stoic Conversations. My name is Caleb Vontiveros,
And I'm Michael Tremblay.
and today we're continuing our series on Cicero's On Ends. We're talking about book 3, so we have 2 previous episodes on ends, as it were. It's a classic work of Roman philosophy, going over different philosophies of life. And this book 3 is the introduction of the Stoics. So it's a classic text on Stoicism because you really get to see a defense of Stoic ethics. Cicero puts an argument for Stoicism in the mouth of the Stoic Cato the Younger, who he knew, um, and does it in a favorable way. So this book is essentially a description of Stoicism, along with arguments for the view.
Mm-hmm. We're at part 3 here. I was thinking about it's like the like Fast and Furious or something. Like, what would be the title of this one? It just keeps getting better each time. We're digging into, as you said, arguments, description of Stoicism, arguments for, and I was really blown away with this book. Also, with how non-pretentious it is, how almost commonsensical Cicero is in his explanation of Stoic ethics and Stoic indifference in particular, which are like really kind of complicated. And he goes through it in a really nice, clear way, which I'm sure we'll cover today, but really down to earth explanation by Cicero, which is appreciated.
Yeah, he's clearly a learned character, but he's a Roman statesman, and he's focused on the life of action, the life of speech, and is an excellent writer, of course. And I think that comes through in some of the translations. So but he is really focused on some of these questions about how you live. One quick note in terms of background that we touched on before briefly is that this work was written around 45 BC. The arguments for Stoicism are put in the mouth of Cato the Younger, who died the previous year. So in a way, this is a tribute to Cato, who Cicero knew, who was a friend, a political rival, political ally throughout his life. So I think you see how Cicero respects Cato, which was a politically risky thing to do at the time, speak well of Cato. But of course, in the next book, you see how he also wants to distance himself from Cato's philosophy. But I think that's an interesting note that Cicero would honor someone like Cato in this way by making him the mouthpiece of Stoic philosophy.
Yeah, that's cool. A lot of the philosophical respect we give people is based on the writings that we have left. Like Epictetus, and there's a certain causality that people are more likely to preserve the good writings, but we give this reverence to Epictetus, to Seneca, to Marcus Aurelius because we can read what they wrote, and it's interesting to see, who is Cicero's spokesman for philosophy for Stoicism. It's Cato. We don't have Cato's writings. We don't have the insight into Cato's mind that someone like Cicero had, but Cicero kind of puts him on that pedestal as that, obviously following also in this Platonic tradition of these dialogues as well. And he's almost the Socrates, right? It's a bit less dialogue-y than Plato, but he is that mouthpiece from which the philosophy is presented.
Yeah, that's right. And it is a good point that this work is not as dialogue heavy. You don't have as much reply response. It's not as much of a conversation. It's more of a matter of these characters giving long speeches, which Cato actually defends, interestingly enough here. The work sort of starts with a little bit of back and forth between Cicero and Cato, but then Cato says, wait, before I can really answer your questions, you need to understand the whole of Stoic theory. So if you don't mind, I'm going to give a long speech explaining Stoicism to you that's going to go on for pages and pages. But that's important. Otherwise, you might leap onto a rebuttal or snatch some advantage from something I've said without fully understanding the system, which is an interesting defense of a kind of the of this form that Cicero decided to write in, and perhaps more broadly, a cool point I think about not wanting to move too quickly in conversation to rebutting what someone has just said when you haven't taken the time to understand, what they would have said if they were given the opportunity to give a long speech about their systems of belief.
Cicero's he's steel manning out here. He's trying
Yeah, that's right.
to present the best version. So let's jump into it.
Cool. Yeah, let's jump into it. This is just a great book because it's, as I said, really a full defense of Stoic ethics, starting with the view of the ancient Stoics had about moral development, and going to justifying some of the classic, of course, the central tenets of Stoicism, that virtue is all one needs for happiness, and importantly for on this work, it's called on ends, which the focus is really on what's the purpose, what's the telos of life, what's the good that everything should aim at. And the Stoic answer is, of course, virtue or morality, as is sometimes translated, is the only good. It's really, that's all you need. But there's also quite a bit of there's also some detail on how Stoics thought about indifference and made sense of this common idea that, well, maybe morality is enough, but aren't some things better than others? Is there any value in non-moral things? So we should definitely get into that. But I think that's a general map of what's going to go on in this book.
Yeah, the other thing, I do want to get into the content for those listening, but the other thing that's interesting is he does that overview of Stoic ethics, and he does some appeal to naturalism. Naturalism, I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but there's some conceptions of nature, and there's some, but he doesn't go, okay, well, for me to do ethics, I need to first talk about logic, or I need to first talk about metaphysics. He almost jumps right into it's almost an explanation of ethics using the terms of ethics. I was struck by basically just how ethics focused it was. He's like, here's everything you need to know about Stoicism or Stoic ethics. And then he just talks about the ethics. He doesn't bring in the other part, which is kind of interesting. I know it's an ethical work. It's about on ends, but there's this kind of modern Stoic debate about how much the role of physics or the role of logic and the importance they play, or how much you need to have the same metaphysical position as of the Stoics for Stoicism to work. And he almost seems to ground all of Stoic ethics on these appeals to things you can see with your eyes, like the behavior of children, or the absurdity of, thinking somebody had a good life if they're very rich, but were internally suffering or a bad person. Like, he almost makes these kind of commonsensical appeals, and he doesn't have to go and talk about um, the nature of matter, or even, as far as I remember from the book, the providential nature of the universe, or anything like this. It really is almost um, I guess like a bottom up construction rather than a top down. And I thought it was impressive. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And it's interesting how it touches on some of these modern debates about how much stoicism do you need in order to be stoic,
Yeah. This
and
is,
perhaps on.
I'll just
Yeah,
say
go ahead.
he's saying not very much. He's basically the point. Is like, this was a really coherent view of Stoic ethics that didn't make any other appeals. We'll get into it and we'll pull that out, but I just want people to pay attention to that as we're talking about it. It's basically justifying it with not very much appeal to the other parts of the school, I would say.
Yeah, yeah. So where he starts, or where at least I'd like to start, is with this picture of development, how humans develop through time. Um, this picture of moral development, which you can contrast with the Epicureans who came in the earlier book. The Epicureans think, we come into the world and what do we want? We want to feel good. We want pleasure. We want to avoid feeling bad. We want to avoid pain. And from that, you get the whole philosophy, this whole hedonistic philosophy. Interestingly, for the Stoics, we humans come into the world and simply seek to preserve themselves. So I'll just read a little. It is the view of those whose system I adopt, this is Cato speaking, that immediately upon birth, a living creature feels an attachment for itself and an impulse to preserve itself and to feel affection for its own constitution and for those things which tend to preserve that constitution, while on the other hand it conceives an antipathy to destruction and to those things which appear to threaten destruction. So, and I think this was going to be important for the next book, but the way the Stoics challenged Epicureans and other philosophers was to insist that we don't merely value pleasure or pain. Instead, what's important for creatures of any type, not merely humans, is self-preservation. And that's a goal that goes above and beyond pleasure and pain, which points to the fact that it's something more of value. Yeah, what's your take on that and sort of the importance of moral principle, of self-preservation and this picture of moral development here?
Yeah, well, it's like it's very similar to the Epicurean one, right? Which is this idea that we look at babies and we can tell from babies what humans are made to do. And the Epicurean's like, if you look at babies, they like pleasure and they don't like pain. And the Stoic view, and you correct me if you feel different, Caleb, is something like, well, no, when you look at babies, they like preserving themselves, or toddlers, and you view pleasure and pain almost becomes a proxy for this. Pleasure and pain becomes the way that you, if you're not a very smart thing yet, because you're a baby or you're an animal and you don't have the complex kind of cognitions that humans do, it's a way that you tell, okay, things that hurt generally are not preserving. Things that feel good generally are preserving. And so you use that as a kind of a proxy. But what humans are really, because the Stoic can't be justified in saying kids don't like pleasure and kids don't hate pain. That's clear. It doesn't make any sense. So they have to say, well, what they're really going for is they're really going for preservation, and they're using that as a way to discern it. I think it's a compelling argument. Um, I guess my issue with it is I'm not so sure what kids do matters that much for how adults are supposed to live. I'm not so sure even if this Epicureans descriptively were right that we just pursue pleasure and avoid pain, that it matters for the adult view. But I think that is like an intelligent Stoic way to get around it. If you did think that was like an important argument. And I think we see this all the time. And this will be the Stoic argument up through adulthood, where Epictetus has this insight of, well, pain can't be a bad thing because athletes endure it, or Spartans gladly endure pain as part of their training, and it makes them feel proud and happy. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like, yeah, well, when you become an adult, you just become better at discerning. Well, that's the kind of pain that's preserving. If I work a job and I make money that I need to, support my family, that's, maybe I don't like my job. It's physical manual labor or something like that. There's some pain I'm withstanding to preserve myself and my family. And that's fine. And that's like, I shouldn't be avoiding that as long as it's achieving that other goal. So it's the same kind of, they're going to make that argument about adults as well. So anyway, I think it's a smart play. I'm not sure how necessary it is to be talking so much about children. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think there's an interesting question about whether it's necessary or not, but I think what's going on in the background for many of these philosophers is this idea that you can find the good life by looking at what is natural. So the Stoic view is that the good life is one that's lived in accordance with nature. So then you would expect, in at least some sense, to see nature as tending towards or revealing, what the good life is, what the Stoic path is in this case. And it would be odd, perhaps. At least the Stoics would need to explain something if the world was such that we came into the world, humans didn't value virtue initially, They don't have a story about how we come to value virtue, but somehow we should, even though in a sense it's unnatural. I think that would put the Stoics, because they have this background view that the good life needs to somehow, in some sense, be natural. That would put them in a funny place. Yeah, what do you think about that? Do you think
Yeah,
that's
I
a
think you're right. That would be an issue. I guess I just think that which I guess the Stoics are also going to argue to a certain extent. I'm thinking this through. So let me try it again. It doesn't seem to me like as big of an issue for the Stoics if they're like, yeah, babies are little pleasure seeking machines, but I am a very different thing than a baby, right? That to me doesn't seem to knock down Stoicism's house of cards. But the Stoics are going to make a different play here, which is all all living things are the kinds of things that do what's good for them and do what is according or seek to preserve their nature. Babies are going to do that in a different way than adults, but what we don't see everybody doing is just pursuing pleasure and pain. That's an
Mhm.
oversimplification. The same way, you might have an animal that tries to bite its leg off instead of die in a trap. It's going to do something that's very painful for the sake of self-preservation. It's appealing to something other than that simple calculus. And yeah, if the Stoics can pull it off, I guess that is a better way to go about it.
Yeah, I suppose that is an interesting question. If you're a Stoic, how much continuity, I suppose, do you need between the baby and the adult human? And there are parts of Stoicism we've talked about before that suggest maybe you don't need that much. They don't see babies, of course, as rational, young children as rational. So maybe it'd be fine to give them the baby the Epicurean impulse, as it were. But that's not what they decide to do. And I think what's interesting about their picture is they do have this. There is this idea of moral development, and they do have a story about how we come to value virtue. We sort of start with this instinct for self-preservation, but come to value what really matters, which is virtue for the Stoics. So I'll just read a quick section on that. The initial principle being thus established that things in accordance with nature are things to be taken for their own sake, and their opposites, similarly, things to be rejected. The first appropriate act is to preserve oneself and one's natural constitution. That's the importance of self preservation. The next is to retain those things which are in accordance with nature and to repel those that are contrary. Then, when this principle of choice and also of rejection has been discovered, there follows next in order choice conditioned by appropriate action. Then such choice becomes a fixed habit, and finally, choice fully rationalized and in harmony with nature. It is at this final stage that the good, properly so called, first emerges and comes to be understood in its true nature. So the picture you get there is, look, we're starting with self-preservation. Then we learn that we have this principle of choice, choosing between indifference, survival, food, social goods, what have you, these sorts of things that we naturally prefer, things that we want to naturally avoid. And as we get older, we have pictures about, what's valuable, how do we make these choices? And then we get this idea of appropriate action, duty, morality. And then from this, we can build a fixed habit. That's that picture. What's virtue? It's a disposition, it's habit, it's character. And once that's formed, then you can have choice fully rationalized and in harmony with nature. A nice phrase. It's not just doing something one off because it's a duty. No, it's fulfilling your duties because that's who you are. Your thinking is harmonized with the way things should be. So I think that's a picture of development. Cato starts there and says, okay, this is how we get to the Stoic view. This is the path that ideally we should take.
Okay, I think that made sense to me, but can we simplify it in like simple language? If you had to redo those steps and like explain it to me like I'm a fifth grader, it's something along the lines of first first we just have an instinct towards self-preservation. Then we become smart enough to choose and to go, well, this is good for me. This is not good for me. This is like, sleeping, eating well, not hurting myself. These are things that I'm going to choose because I see them as being in recognition with my nature, or in accordance with my nature, or preserving of my constitution, whatever language you want to use. And then there's another step. I guess I got a little bit lost on the other step, which is something like the actual choice itself becomes the good thing, instead of the consequence of it. Because there has to be a shift there between, the baby doesn't have reason. The baby is right, or even the toddler is right, that the cookie is a good thing for the toddler. But at some point you become an adult and the cookie becomes an indifferent thing, preferred indifferent. And then the choice becomes the good thing. Like, does your constitution change in that process? Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, it's really it's sort of like if you imagine a scenario where, just use that classic example that Cicero mentions here, where you're shooting an arrow at a target. Initially, what do you need to shoot the arrow to the target? You need to be alive. That's the first step. So, humans come into the world and we need to survive to do anything. And you can almost imagine, in this age of AI, if you're training a simple agent playing this game, shooting an arrow at a target, it's alive, realizes it needs to be alive to do this. Then what's it going to realize next? It's going to realize the consequences of its actions are sometimes preferable, sometimes dispreferable. So if it hits the center of the target, everyone cheers. When it misses, people boo, and that feels bad. So slowly we come to learn that some consequences of our actions are preferable and dispreferable. And then over time we realize, in a way, what matters is, how tightly we hold the string, where we aim and such. And these are these sort of principles of choice. And then that, in the end, is what we can control. And that's what we start valuing, because we learn the consequences, although, they determine, how we should choose. Those consequences aren't always up to us. Instead, it's, how we aim, how we play the game. And that is what the AI in the simple example might start optimizing, instead of purely trying to get an outcome. So maybe that's an example that helps ground it a little more. And then you just think about that for the rest of life. We learn that what our natural instincts might be pointed towards certain outcomes. We just seek those outcomes blindly as a matter of instinct. And as we become more rational, we learn to choose between those instincts. And then we see, what really matters is that skill of choice. It's choosing well. And that's what's up to us. And that's what we are. So that's what we start to value. And that becomes, we understand that as virtue, understand that as morality.
There almost is like this, ought implies can. There it is. Like, as we become smart enough to actually reflect and actually make choices, and I mean smart enough, I mean in terms of like literally developing from being a child into an adult brain, we become reflective. We develop the ability to reflect on the quality of our choices. Then our nature shifts. We shift from like animal-like things to rational things. And so I think that's, for me, is the part that was missing from your explanation, is like, not only do you learn more as you grow up, but the kind of thing you are changes as well. And so to achieve your function, you go from being more similar to an animal than not to being a human, which for the Stoics is a different kind of thing. It has a different kind of goal, which is, as you said, to focus on the things that are up to you, to aim well, to make good choices, to have knowledge. That becomes preservation, and maintenance of that becomes promoting the constitution of the human, the essential parts of the human, in a way that it's not true for a toddler. So you don't just learn more about what it is to be a person, you change I think it's like those two things at the same time is a bit confusing to me, but the way you described it makes sense to me. I think with the change or the emphasis that I've added.
Yeah, I think that's right. You change because you become more rational, and that gives you the ability to focus just more on that faculty,
Mm-hmm.
which, as you say, is an essential part of your constitution: reasoning well, thinking well, managing impressions, not purely being making decisions on instinct and such. I think you also learn, and this is something Cato mentions here, is that you learn some sort of ethical principles. So some philosophers held that if something's good, then more of that thing is in a sense always better. And that's something the Stoics put a question mark on. A number of other ancient philosophers put a question mark behind. That perhaps more of a good thing isn't always better. Health isn't something you're just trying to maximize across life. Instead, what you ought to be maximizing, to the extent that idea is appropriate, is wisdom. That ability that helps you choose between health and the other things in life. That is, I think, a central part of Stoicism, and maybe some way what makes it different from other philosophies like utilitarianism and such that say, you should just maximize pleasure. Stoics say, no, that's not what you want to be thinking about. Is focusing on that ability to choose between different things of value, different indifference, because that's what life is. That's what they see life as being about.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay, that makes sense to me. So we've got the developmental picture, and then what comes? What comes next?
Yeah, so we've got the developmental picture, and then I think what comes next is, okay, what's this end stage? What is choice fully rationalized and in harmony with nature? What does that look like? For the Stoics, that looks like acting virtuously, and that is enough. So I think those are the two central claims that Cato talks about throughout the rest of the book. First, the idea that morality is the ultimate good, virtue is the ultimate good. I'll just use those terms interchangeably here.
Mm-hmm.
And he gives a few different arguments for that. Another central idea is just this idea of indifference. What makes the Stoics different from other philosophers like Aristo, or perhaps some of the Cynics, which agree that virtue is all you need, but they don't have these distinctions, this other idea of indifference, and they don't distinguish between other kinds of value. So I see those as the sort of the two other points of the book. Does you think that's right?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was such a. I want to get into the description of indifference because I think he does a really good job of covering that. Definitely.
Okay, cool. Yeah, before we do that, I'll just touch on some of the arguments for why morality is the only good. We don't need to dive into them into detail here. We've talked about this throughout the podcast, but I think some points that might be a difference that some of y'all might not have heard before, you haven't come across this work, which I thought were interesting. So there's an interesting argument from praise. It's perhaps a deceptively simple one, but it's put in a nice syllogistic form. Whatever is good is praiseworthy, but whatever is praiseworthy is morally honorable. Therefore, that which is good is morally honorable. And I think the praiseworthy aspect, Cato talks about, it gives a simple example. Can you be proud of a life that is miserable or not happy? And he thinks, no, you can only be proud when one's lot is a happy one. And, this shows that the happy life is something you should be proud of. And this cannot be said of any life but one that is morally honorable. Therefore, the moral life is the happy life. That's an interesting argument. I'm not sure if it's persuasive. People might think it sort of begs the question, but perhaps it's an interesting one if you have similar ideas about honor, praise, and think of that idea. Is a good life something you can sit back and be proud of when you're on your deathbed, as it were? And the answer seems probably yes. And then is morality enough for you to be proud of that good life? And if you did your best, if you really did your best, isn't that enough at the end of a life? Do you really need these other things philosophers say you need for your life to go well? And I think that's an interesting argument.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that it begs the question, and so in the same way, it almost ref- it appeals to our intuitions about what is praiseworthy. But I like that. I like that it's like a different way of talking. We're spending all this time talking about good. We're spending all this time talking about happiness. What if you just thought about what is praiseworthy? And that's what I like. Like sometimes I do that when I'm trying to explain eudaimonia about. Well, it's like think of it like a great life or a flourished life, and I think that metaphor of praiseworthy is a really good one because you can think of people who they suffered, they sacrificed a lot. I'm thinking of people in terrible kinds of situations who maybe lived under fear and stress, but um, maybe in some sort of war zone, but saved a lot of lives. Had a terrible time. It was not a pleasant Epicurean, uh, you know, commune, but they did great things in these stressful situations, and that is praiseworthy. And then the Stoic is going to say, and that person, as long as they were like that consistently, was also a happy, good person. And there's that, I guess that I think it does. Yeah. So I think it does beg the question, but it's maybe a different lens by which to look at Stoic happiness. Where if you think less about what life is going to make you happy and more about the life that is like deserving of praise, and because for Stoicism those are the same thing, it's a different way to get there. I'm not persuaded if I didn't already believe it, um, but it's maybe a different way to think about what happiness looks like.
Yeah, I think it's a cool avenue into the Stoic view, and also a nice snapshot of how a culture like the Roman culture that so valued things like glory, reputation, and
Hmm.
such, you might make the Stoic picture more intuitive to that kind of culture. Um, yeah, so that's a neat argument for that idea. Another argument for Stoicism you get here is the belief that something is bad often causes us to dread that thing happening, and that can sometimes cause a loss of wisdom. This dread, anxiety, and such. And as because of this, we really only ought to fear things which are that we can, of course, prevent. Otherwise, if you fear not having a solid reputation, not having good health, and such, there's some risk that that fear might cause you to make a mistake. So, again, I think this is not an entirely persuasive argument if you're not a Stoic already, but I think it's another avenue to the Stoic view, along with really a practical, pragmatic point, which is that idea that what we believe, what we think, what we value, it does influence our decisions, and as such, you know how to be exceptionally careful about how you think and what you value.
I mean, is this the kind of the same argument as like Epictetus's thing about death isn't terrible, but it's how we view it? Is it the same kind of argument there about like these things are bad for you because you fear them, and if you don't fear them, they cease to be bad? Can you explain it a bit more?
I think it's not just the cognitive view of emotion. I think it's more of a causal claim, almost a practical, pragmatic one, which is that if you it's sort of if we go back to that example of shooting the arrow, if you're always nervous about hitting the target exactly, some of your attention is going to be taken on that outcome instead of focusing your attention on practicing the skill of being a good archer,
Hmm.
which is uh, the things that are up to you. You know, how you're holding the bow, your posture, your timing. So it's all maybe more of a pragmatic point about attention and how our beliefs about what's good or bad, once they're divorced from virtue, can cause us to act less virtuously. And I think this is an especially perhaps more of a sharp point for other life philosophies, which say virtue is good. It's perhaps even essential for living the good life, but it's not sufficient. So I think that's where this argument might have some more bite to it or force to it, which is to say that, if you already think virtue is good, then whenever you move your attention to something else, there's that risk
Hmm.
that you forsake virtue to some extent.
Okay, I
So I
understand.
think it's a little bit, yeah, it's a little bit more of a practical, pragmatic point, perhaps.
Almost about the sufficiency of virtue for being good. Um, you already think it's good, and once you think it's good, it's better to just focus on just that, because there's these risks that come with valuing these other things.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. So those are some of the arguments that stuck out for me in terms of arguments for that central Stoic idea that virtue is enough. Do you have anything else to add on to this?
I mean, I just like the way I just like the way that he frames it in relation to Aristotle and the Peripatetics, the followers of Aristotle, and this really kind of, it's a way that just I just realized how influenced I am by this book when I read it. Maybe for the first time 5 or 6 years ago, where he just really does just structure in terms of the Epicureans think this, the skeptics think this, the Aristotelians think that, look, there are a bunch of good things, and yeah, virtue is one of them, but there's these other good things too, and you kind of want all of them. And then you almost position the Aristotelian view as being the most commonsensical and the most intuitive, of like virtue is a good thing and there's these other good things too. And then you're working
Mhm.
from that position. You've just got to kind of, your work to convince people of Stoicism is just to kind of eliminate those other things. So it's just to kind of, if you can make these arguments, and then that's where these arguments kind of around indifference I think comes in about, well, can you really call any of these things good when it's circumstantial, whether or not they benefit you? Can you call these things good when there's these counterexamples of when they'll actually harm you, or these counterexamples
Mhm.
when being healthy or wealthy or having a lot of pleasure is actually bad for you, or these counterexamples of where being sick or poor or struggling or actually benefiting to you. And so it's like you break down the logic of that, and you're only left with this one thing that's like always good. Um, I like that framing of Stoicism in relation to the Aristotelians, and you're just like kind of just like one jump away. You're almost at Stoicism. Almost anybody's going to agree with that Aristotelian view, and then you're almost there at Stoicism. Just a little bit more convincing after that.
Yeah, that's a great point, and something I didn't hit on as much, or that I should have hit on earlier, which is at this point in the dialogue, that's what that's sort of who Cato is arguing against. He says, we've dispatched the Epicureans essentially. So who are the other rivals? Well, it's people like the Peripatetics, the followers of Aristotle, on one side, who value things in addition to virtue, and then on the other side, it's people like Aristo, perhaps some of the Cynics, who think no, it's just virtue, and all this idea of indifference is nonsense. It's just not needed. So something that Cicero asks Cato explicitly is, aren't you just saying the exact same thing as Aristo? And Cato says no, because we have this idea of indifference. And there's a nice passage about why indifferents are important. So Aristo holds that everything is indifferent except for virtue. But I should say, when I'm talking about indifference, I mean, the Stoics have this idea of preferred indifference and dispreferred indifference, this other level of value, if you will, that's essential to the picture. There's a distinction between indifference. And he says, for if we maintained that all things were absolutely indifferent, the whole of life would be thrown into confusion, as it is by Aristo. And no function or task could be found for wisdom, since there would be absolutely no distinction between the things that pertain to the conduct of life, and no choice need be exercised among them. And I think this is a nice, when I first read this book, when I first came across the Stoics, I thought their ethics didn't make any sense, because you had this idea of virtue is the only good, but somehow there's this other level of value, preferred indifference and dispreferred indifference, that exists and you need to be mindful of. And my reaction was essentially, well, is virtue the only good or not? If you, what's the the point of indifference? Why not just be like Aristo? And I think I didn't fully internalize this response, which is that the role indifferents play is they are the material for virtue. They're what you're choosing between, and you need some things to be dispreferred and preferred, because that's sort of what guides your choice. And going back to that picture of development, that's sort of where we start with, are these natural instincts for what's preferred and dispreferred. And then as we become rational, we're able to exercise virtue and work on that capability of choosing the preferred, choosing between indifference well. So anyway, I found coming back to this book with that background, it helps me see the picture much more clearly.
Yeah, I mean, this is also this indifference is something that I've also wrestled with. It's funny you said that, because when I remember first learning about Stoicism, and I was like, this is also dumb. I was definitely in that introductory philosophy class, and I was like, Epicureanism is where it's at. These guys had it figured out. Clearly, it's all about pleasure and pain. And now I am mature, fully gone through my developmental stages here. But I also had trouble internalizing. I mean, I still had trouble wrestling with it, and especially when you read Epictetus, like as much as I did, Aristo can feel appealing, because Aristo, we did a whole conversation on him, but as a reminder, Aristo's argument is basically, look, to talk about something being preferred or dispreferred doesn't make any sense, because it's going to be a situation by situation decision. How can you say death is dispreferred when it's something you will sometimes choose and sometimes not choose? How can you say that wealth or money is preferred when sometimes money is bad and sometimes money is good? It's nonsensical to apply categories to indifference, to things outside of virtue. What you need to do is you need to look at the actual situation you're in, and then you will have money will be good in one situation to have, and it will be bad in another. And then that's Aristo's argument, as I understand it. And I think there's something compelling to that. This idea that it's weird to apply categories to things and then be like, well, not this time. Money's good or money's preferred. Well, not here, but to be charitable to the Stoics are saying, when you say something's preferred, you're not actually saying anything about the specific situation. You're saying something about a kind of general tendency. And then it's your job to ascertain if that general tendency applies here or not. Health is generally a good thing. And that's it's honestly like a claim about averages. 9 times out of 10, it's better to be healthy than sick, but it's your job. And that's the exercising of virtue, wisdom, diligence, to tell in that situation if this is one of the 9 times it's good, or one of the 1 out of 10 times it's better to be sick. 1 out of 100 times. And then the Stoics are going to say what makes the category difference with virtue and vice is that those are 100 out of 100 times you should choose virtue. There's never a case not to choose virtue. And so there's a type difference there. And I don't know where I'm going with this, other than I found Aristo's argument really convincing when I first started to learn Stoicism. It's like, why not just take it situation by situation? And then they're saying, look, these things tend to be a certain way. And the reason they tend to be a certain way is because they connect to us as rational animals, right? Things like health, money, fame. These connect to our social natures, our physical natures as embodied brains. We're not just floating minds. And so we should try to preserve that physical constitution, that social constitution, wherever possible. And so you're going to have good reason. You need a good reason to opt out of health. You need a good reason to opt out of money. And then that's virtue's job to decide if this is a good reason to do that or not. Um, I don't know how smooth that was, but that to me makes sense. It's taken me a long time, but I think the indifferent picture finally makes sense. And because my tendency, I guess, was to go towards the Aristo side or to bounce back between the Aristotelian side. Like I find both of those counter arguments pretty appealing. It's like it's only virtue or it's virtue plus other things. The Stoic position is this really weird counterintuitive middle ground, but I don't know. I think the version I just presented to you makes sense to me now. I feel I'm persuaded by it. Do you find it persuasive now, or you feel the same way as before?
Yeah, I find it more persuasive, and I think it's one reason it was difficult for me to understand in the past is because I think so often there are some of these assumptions about if you want to ask, what's the purpose of life? Well, it's to pursue some good. So then you find the good, and then you just want as much of it as possible. I think that's a common sort of picture. The sort of idea that more good is always better and such. And that that picture is really persuasive. The Stoics really radically challenge that picture because there is no single thing where more of it is always better. Either you're acting virtuously, which is enough in the moment, or everything else is indifferent, and you're choosing between them. And sometimes they're going to be, as you say, sometimes pleasure is what you should choose. Other times it's not. And that picture of life doesn't fit nicely into a lot of the philosophies you encounter in ordinary life, ordinary culture, but also in the classroom of philosophers. We were thinking about Kantianism versus utilitarianism versus even some of the classics you'll encounter in introductory philosophy like Aristotelianism. It's really a different framework, and that can make it difficult to grasp initially.
Is there anywhere else we use this framework? Like the Stoics are going to appeal to games. And that's something Epictetus does explicitly. Is he'll appeal, like, when you're
Mhm.
playing basketball, there's nothing really good about a ball going into a net, but there is this story we tell ourselves. I don't know if it's a story. It's kind of a material. It's an opportunity for us to exercise our skill. But even that, the metaphor doesn't really land now that I think about it. Right? Even Epictetus's example is flawed because on the Stoic example, no, there is actually something good about the ball going to the net. There is something. I want to be careful with my language here. Maybe not good. There is something preferable about health. I'm not sure there's something preferable about the ball going into a net. Is there any example where we kind of have this two-layer value system anywhere else?
Well, I think games, as you say, are useful. In a sense, the Stoic answer maybe it's not that helpful as well. Everywhere else, you have this two-layer value system, and perhaps another way of coming at it is to oppose it to the view of a craft where
Hmm.
you're just trying to pursue the outcome. So if you just have a view about, say, physicians, the purpose of a physician is to promote health. And if you're not promoting health, you're not a good physician. The Stoics might say, first, that's not how you should think about the craft of being a physician. But if we're using simple analogies, you should think more of virtue as, and I think that this is an example that Cicero has Cato use here, which is you should think of virtue as dancing or acting, where the performance itself is what's valuable, not the production of some outcome. And perhaps when you see crafts like that and think about, oh, that's what's important is the performance itself, then maybe also you can change how you think about what it is to be a physician. To be a physician is to be skilled, do what typically promotes health, but do your best, given what's given what's under your control. That might not be what ends up always, in fact, producing more health, doing what's good for people. So I think that's not a direct answer to your question, perhaps. Maybe that's a way to get into it, is thinking about the first this idea that virtue, that's intrinsically valuable, sort of in the same way that acting, dancing, as the performance itself. And then, okay, if that's what you're trying to do, thinking about, okay, well, what makes some performance good or not? And that's where this picture, and that's where indifference comes into play. They're the thing that makes some choices better than others, is that you're properly managing indifference, properly managing your oppressions and such.
Yeah, but they have to, and that's to get away from the Aristo point, is they have to make things better than others. Some decisions have to be better than others because the material matters. You can make a wrong decision. Just to be a silly example, but to cut off your finger when you're sitting around and treat that as the same as scratching your chin
Mm-hmm.
is the wrong decision. The Stoic
Yeah.
would say you've messed up, and you've messed up on the grounds of indifference. But you've taken one of the worst indifferent things you can do, which is like destroy your bodily constitution in the Stoics' view, for no reason. Whereas to get your finger cut off because somebody's threatening you, the Epictetus example, demanding you vote the right way in the Senate, and you say, well, I don't care. You have to cut off my pinky. I don't care. That's a very good thing to do, because now
Mm-hmm.
you've given up that indifferent for a good reason. But the Stoic view has to be that the pinky matters. It's just not, it doesn't matter in the same way as virtue and vice. And I just, because if it doesn't matter, you end up at the Aristo position. And Cicero is very clear, as you said, that it's like, how can you in Cicero's view, Aristo has no way to differentiate between scratching your chin and cutting off your pinky, because the difference in those decisions is that you've actually screwed up some sort of benefit calculus, or like indifferent calculus or indifferent math, right?
Mm-hmm.
You get what I'm saying there?
Yeah, I think so. There's a discussion in this book on suicide, and
Yeah.
Cicero makes a point that um, even virtue itself can tell you to end your life, because sometimes it might be better to, uh, end your life for the sake of others, or merely because the rest, you're certain that the rest of your life is going to be full of dispreferred indifference, would be the clunky Stoic phrase, I suppose, but full of pain, what have you. So,
I
and
think,
that's, yeah, go ahead.
well, I was going to, like, because you said it's a clunky phrase. I do think when you get down to the Greek, the better translation is something like "don't make a differences," not indifferences. And when I think of that in terms of like, doesn't make a difference for being happy or unhappy,
Yeah.
it almost like reduces the scope of indifference. It's not indifference entirely. It's that they don't make a
Mm-hmm.
differences. If you're like, hey, is you know, if I say, well, I have my friend John, his childhood friend, he's got a lot of money, he's got a bunch of cars. Do you think he's a happy guy? The Stoics have to say, well, you've told me a bunch of don't make a difference facts about him. Give me some of the make a difference facts, which is like, is he a courageous guy? Is he a just guy? Is he a wise guy? That sounds not good, but does he have wisdom? Um, and that almost helps me understand indifference a bit more. It's like it's not, again, it's not that they're devoid of value in one sense, it's that they don't make a difference. And then again, when you say, well, there's the only good is virtue, again, the good thing in the Stoics view is the thing that is always beneficial, the thing that is
Mm-hmm.
always
Yeah.
desirable and always selectable. And so the Stoics again are reducing the scope of what good means, and they're not meaning these things are not better to have. They're meaning the good thing is the thing that is always desirable, always beneficial. I don't know if that was helpful. I'm trying to make sense of it. I thought I had it, and now the more we talk about it, the more indifference stress me out.
All right. Well, I'll need to wrap up, and perhaps you do as well. We're going a bit over, but some places I wanted to end is there just some nice lines on from Cicero here. There's a statement of the Stoic view of emotions. The mere fact that men endure the same pain more easily when they voluntarily undergo it for the sake of their country than when they suffer it for some lesser cause shows that the intensity of the pain depends on the state of mind of the sufferer, not on its intrinsic nature. That's a great example and well stated view of the Stoic view of emotions. How you think determines how you feel. And then there's some nice lines on virtue. The light of a lamp is eclipsed and overpowered by the rays of the sun. A drop of honey is lost in the vastness of the Aegean Sea. An additional sixpence is nothing amid the wealth of Croesus, or a single step in the journey from here to India. Similarly, if the Stoic definition of the end of goods be accepted, it follows that all the value you set on bodily advantages must be absolutely eclipsed and annihilated by the brilliance and majesty of virtue.
That's a great line.
Yeah. Cool. Anything else?
No, I love
Worth
that.
the summary?
Eclipsed. I mean, again, and it makes me wonder how much of this stuff is like pedantic. I don't know, pedantic is but when something's eclipsed, it still exists. There's still some microscopic value. The Stoic point might be that there's just no kind of behavior directing value. There's no, these indifferents don't have a value that would ever cause you to choose them over virtue. And in such case, and so when we're arguing about like the only good, or this is a different kind of, at the end of the day, the point is just that you should always choose virtue over these indifferents. And you exercise virtue by selecting the indifference well, but you always choose virtue over the indifference. And that's ultimately practically the implication that matters.
Yeah, I think so. I think these lines might be motivational if you're thinking about a specific indifferent perhaps here and its bodily advantage. That's eclipsed by virtue. But of course, what is virtue? It's being able to choose skillfully between indifference. So you always have that almost that paradox that I initially thought made no sense, which is that focus on virtue is the only good, but also of course the idea that other things matter. And I think it's explained well in this classic work. It's a great statement of Stoicism, but of course there's still some more wrestling one needs to do with the ideas.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thanks, Caleb.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks, Michael.